In this CBT Nugget, we're talking about the planning and the implementation of virtualization for Exchange. And honestly, we have a long journey for this. This is video number 1 out of, there's going to be 3 of them. Yeah, there's going to be 3 of them for this. And there's a reason for this. It's not that technically virtualizing Exchange is that complicated, but depending upon your environment, you may have inherent design complexity. Think about it this way. Just like when you were working with physical servers, and you may still be using physical servers, you could be a small company that only has 1 or 2 servers, or you could be a large company that has hundreds of them spread throughout the world. And with all of the high availability options, we've just got a lot to talk about. So, and we're going to be talking about the pros and the cons, and Hyper-V, and well, let me just say, I'm using Hyper-V kind of like Kleenex. We will specifically talk about Hyper-V, but also VM Workstation, VMware, all that kind of good stuff. The requirements that Exchange will expect, how to get performance out of Exchange. We've got a lot of fun stuff to do over these next 3 videos. So let's start off with the agenda, though, for this video that we're going to do on virtualization. You're so accustomed at this point to having me have 4 or 5 things listed here, and I only have 2. They're 2 very important topics. They're kind of big topics. We want to start off with looking at the pros and cons of virtualization. Yep, I said it. Pros and cons. There are some cons to virtualizing Exchange. And here's the thing, though, and I don't want to be like the guy that spoils the end of a movie that you haven't seen yet. But at the end of the day, I think the pros will outweigh the cons. What the cons really are is a challenge to your planning and to your knowledge of virtualization. In other words, all of the cons can easily be resolved. They just need to be resolved, and you should be aware of them. But I think you'll find the pros to virtualization, especially today, with both our private cloud environments. It is really, really a benefit to setting up your messaging that way. At least I'm a huge proponent of it. But we'll take you through it so that you can decide on all of that. Also, we need to stand back for a few minutes and talk about virtualization. And I'm going to specifically talk about Hyper-V. Now, I just want to point out that if you're using VMware or whatever else, I'm going to give you some notes on that too. I would just want to point out that most of the recommendations that I'm giving you with Hyper-V they work the same. Whether you're using VMware or not. Also, I am going to give some specific information about Hyper-V. Hyper-V version 3 that's in Server 2012 and above is truly pretty awesome. So, and I really, really like it. Now, I virtualized on VMware and I virtualized on Hyper-V. Is there one that I prefer over the other? No, there really isn't. But Hyper-V definitely has some specifics that I want to make sure that we give to you. So, so we're going to do the Hyper-V stuff. Well, what do you say we get started with the pros and the cons of virtualization? So you're thinking about virtualizing Exchange. Well, if you come from more of a classic, can I say classic environment, a more traditional environment where you have Exchange as implemented on physical servers, you might be a little bit hesitant to do this, especially if you had a medium or larger size environment. You probably lived through a lot of the challenges of getting your Exchange environment to perform correctly. In other words, you had to be very concerned about several things that we're going to talk about here and throughout this entire course. Things like input output per second, or IOPS, for your disk speed, your disk size, your processing. All of these things were definitely challenges that you faced during a physical implementation, and they don't go away when you do a virtualized implementation. So if you're thinking about virtualization, it's actually something you definitely want to go through the same process that you went through before on figuring out your performance. Here's something, and I'm going to draw a line here in the middle of I think I'm going to draw a line here in the middle. Draw a line here in the middle for pros and for cons, so we'll put pros over here and cons over here. I'm just going to put a con up right from the very, 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 very beginning. You're saying, well, why don't you start with the pros first and sell us on this? Well, I'm not trying to sell you on anything, but planning your hardware for your host machine is paramount. Plan hardware carefully. Carefully. Just like you did with the physical implementation, the host machine hardware evaluation that you're going to do is just as important. And one of the things that I've run across is it seems like, and maybe it's because of, we do a lot of virtualizing on our laptops, right? We create lab environments. And if you've done that yourself, you know that sometimes you'll create a VM and, you'll give it, a couple of gigabytes of RAM so it fits on your laptop. And you can get the product to work in that amount of level. And then what happens is for some reason, a lot of admins translate that to their production level environment. In other words, they think that just because it's been virtualized, they can reduce the amount of hardware that they're giving their virtual machines. That's actually not the case. It's the opposite of that. We've got to make sure that our virtual machines have, just what we would normally do in a physical implementation. So planning the hardware, especially that host, is really, really important. And then one of the other cons that you're going to run across too is, I keep playing with the cons, but yeah, this is another con. You need some experts. You need experts. Either you've got to be the experts or you have to have them at hand. So you already know you need to have an Exchange expert. That would be you. And determining the resource capacities that you need, the amount of memory, the amount of hardware, all of that stuff. But you know what you also need for experts? And it looks like I wrote exports, but it's supposed to be experts. You're also going to need to have a virtualization expert. Again, that might be you, but if it isn't, you're definitely going to have someone that understands not only the host hardware side of it, but your virtualization platform. Now, we're going to talk more about Hyper-V in here and other virtualization platforms, but you definitely have to be an expert at that, and not just, I've installed it once and I know how to get it to work, but we're talking about the full boat of everything that you need to be able to do with it, including high availability. So this is some pretty, big-time expertise you have to have. Another con that kind of relates to this is suddenly your performance monitoring gets to be a little bit more challenging. If you work with virtualized environments, then you know that running perfmon right on the VM isn't exactly always going to work really well, because remember that virtualization platform is kind of lying to the VM, right? It's telling it things that may or may not be true. So you have to do performance monitoring with tools that understand that it's being virtualized. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's definitely a con and one of the challenges to it. There's also some additional cons that we're going to be running across as we work with this. A couple of things, like we'll talk about Exchange. You can't use snapshots, which is something very common that's used in virtual environments. I'm going to probably write this 3 or 4 times. No snapshots. We'll talk about why, but snapshotting Exchange is shopping? No, shotting Exchange is a very bad idea. You can corrupt databases. It's not going to be good. So there's a lot of cons to understanding what to deal with on your virtualized environment. At this point, you're probably going, well, then why would I even bother virtualizing? It's so much easier just to leave it on physical gear. Well, there's a lot of benefits to virtualizing it. Why would I even bother bringing it up, right? So the entire left half of the screen hasn't been filled in yet. First of all, just a couple of side notes. All of the roles in Exchange can be virtualized. All roles can be virtualized. And I'm just writing virt for that. Now, if you worked with previous versions of Exchange, this wasn't always the case. Matter of fact, there could be drawbacks to, such as virtualizing your mailbox role was one of the harder ones, because the virtualization platform, unless you set it up just right, you had problems getting the IOPS through the VM, the guest VM, down to your hardware, and so it could be challenging. Today, Exchange, all roles fully virtualized, which is great. Now, one of the other benefits to virtualization is really this optimizes your hardware. It really does. Optimizes hardware. And I'm just going to put HW for hardware. And you guys, if you've worked with virtualization before, you may have a server that's really working pretty hard, and then you have a few servers they're not working that hard. Well, if you take those physical servers, put them on a host system that's virtualized, you can better utilize those resources. For servers aren't using certain resources, give them to servers that are using those resources. So you've got a much better strategy for handling that. Now, there's a couple of also good points with virtualization. Remember in a previous video, we were talking about DAGs, right? The high availability kind of stuff, the resilient kind of stuff. We still have all of this high availability. I'm going to put HA for this, and then put DAG, and load balancing the CAS. We still have all these capabilities. Now, there are some issues we want to talk about with this, some things we want to watch out for. One of my favorite things is when everybody puts load balance CAS, they put them all on the same host. Think that through for a second. So if they lose one of the CAS boxes, they're good, but if they lose the entire host, oops. So there are a few things we want to think through that aren't really necessarily something that just comes to mind right away. But you get still all of these same features. As a matter of fact, you'll find out that you can even combine these with your virtualization platform's high availability features. So besides, optimizing your hardware, which is really the big one for virtualization, all of your roles can get virtualized. We still can do all of the high availability. Today we can get great performance for our disk operations, for our disk, because we get much better pass through to the storage now, both to SAN and whatever it is that you would like to use. All of these pros, I almost said cons, start to add up. And I have to tell you, while management sometimes can be a little bit more challenging because it requires people with a greater expertise, right? It requires more of them, requires a greater one. And it might be a little bit more challenging at first to do performance monitoring. We may have some limitations, especially with Exchange, that you may not at first be comfortable with. I got to tell you, the snapshotting thing is not going to be a big deal because we have high availability. That's what we have it for. But at any rate, what it all ends up at the day is that most people look at virtualization as one giant pro, simply because of optimizing our hardware and also in management. We'll talk a little bit in this video about System Center Virtual Machine Manager. Wow, what a great way to manage your virtualized environment. And the thing is, it does more than just Hyper-V. And again, I'm not trying to sell this on you, but it does more than Hyper-V. It can also manage VMware and Citrix. So there's a lot that can be done for management that really, if you had physical boxes all over the place, it makes it much more difficult. Also, think about the reduction in your overall hardware. Let me try to say that again. Instead of all those physical boxes and all those power cords and all of those APC or power backups and all of those network cables, all of those things that can go wrong. Remember when we were talking about resilience and high availability, out of all of those things that can go wrong, you're now centralizing it more. You're bringing it into, these bigger hosts where you're buying better hardware for these hosts. They have multiple power supplies. You end up having less gear, less cables, and a better performing environment. So all in all, pretty much the pros always outweigh the cons when it comes to virtualization. For most people, they do. Now, if you're going to virtualize, how do you virtualize, and what do you virtualize on, and what does all this virtualization stuff mean? Well, let's take a look at that next, and we're going to use the word Hyper-V, but we'll talk about that. We've got a lot, we're basically going to talk about a lot of virtualization platforms. Okay, so let's talk about some of the benefits to your virtualization platform and some of the things you want to watch out for. And I am going to specifically be talking about Hyper-V. I think I've said that enough now. However, I also want to point this out, that this can be or whatever you are using. Now, the thing is that I'm a huge VMware fan. I'm a huge Hyper-V fan. I have to tell you that with Hyper-V version 3, which came out with Server 2012, I'm even more of a Hyper-V fan. If you combine that with the management of System Center Virtual Machine Manager, I know it makes me sound like a Microsoft fanboy, but I swear to God, this product really, really excels as a hypervisor. So first of all, a couple of concepts, and then we'll kind of dive into how Hyper-V specifically can be a great kind of thing for you. You guys, if you've worked with virtualization, you got your hardware down here, and what we're going to do is we have an OS that we're going to put on this hardware. And, in our case, we're going to talk a little bit about 2008 R2, but I got to tell you, you really want to put Server 2012 on it, if you're working with Hyper-V kind of thing. And we're going to put in and when you install the Hyper-V role, you get this hypervisor that's in here. And this is the thing that's going to give us access to our hardware, and it's going to allow us to virtualize our guest machines. Now, a lot of times this will be referred to as the parent partition, or just the host. The virtualization host, is really what most of us will use for. And on top of that, we can make these child partitions or these guest machines. And that's what we're going to do, is put these guest machines on here. And there's a reason why I'm drawing this picture. I know you already understand what virtualization is, but I just want you to kind of understand, make sure that we have a good understanding that these guest machines have to share this hardware. And so what I see a lot is I'll see a lot of admins really set up an environment, especially with Exchange, where I have to use one of my favorite lines out of the movie Top Gun. It's when, and I can't remember, Maverick or whatever just did the overflight of the battleship or something and had really screwed up, and the bald guy with the cigar said, "Son, you're writing checks your body can't cash." That's my favorite line. Well, that's what happens is that, I've got hardware down here, and what they'll do is they'll either constrain, they'll make the VMs way too small for the application on them. Giving 2 gig to a VM that's running Exchange would be crazy. Or they'll try to make the VMs, they'll add more VMs than what the host hardware is capable of dealing with and what it's capable of running. That's just not going to be good no matter how you look at this picture. So what you have to do is balance. You have to balance the hardware with what your virtual machines or your guest machines require. And so what that comes down to is it's pretty simple. What you would normally calculate that an Exchange role needs, and we're going to talk more details about this, but let's pretend for a second that I've got a mailbox role and it needs 8 gigabytes of RAM. And it needs to have, because of the amount of mailboxes, and we'll talk about this, a core, a normal mail profile, a core can do about 1,000 mailboxes. Let's say I have to have 2 cores in here. Well, if I make a guest VM with anything less than that, then you can expect that that VM is going to have worse performance and that it's not going to perform well. So the moral of the story, we got to make sure everything performs well. Now, I'll tell you what here, hang on a second here, and let me clear this screen because I want to give you some more specifics. There, I managed to clear the screen. Yay. Okay, a couple of other specifics. Now, this is Hyper-V specifics, and so, as a matter of fact, I'm not kidding. A buddy of mine just came up to me the other day and was asking me, he says, I've got 2,000, oops, that's the, wait a minute, where's my pen? I've got 2008 R2. Is there any real benefit for me going to 2012? Seriously? 2012 or right now 2012 R2? Is there any benefit? Well, yeah. Let's begin the list. There's, like 140 pages I could give you on that. But his interest was specifically in Hyper-V. And I got to be honest with you, there's some like ridiculous numbers for Hyper-V. So let me see if I can remember. I think, and if I'm correct here, the total number of like logical processors under 2008 R2 for Hyper-V was like 64, and now it's like 320. Now, guys, I'm going to throw out some numbers here that's just redonkulous. I think physical total RAM, and I can't spell the word physical. Let's get physical. No, I won't do the song anymore. Physical RAM, if, in your hyper environment, it was like 1 terabyte, and now it's like 4 terabytes. There's this one ridiculous number just blows my mind is the memory per VM. So memory per VM, I think in 2008 R2. And it was, what was it? It was like 64 gig, right? I think it was 64 gig. And the memory now is like 1 terabyte. per VM. And another number that really just blew my mind was, and I remember when they were kind of like, and look at new Hyper-V 3 and what we can do. The total number, so the max number of VMs was I think 1,000. Which is a pretty ridiculous number, but now it's like 8,000 under 2012. So these numbers, do they really matter in your planning at this point? Probably not. I mean, if you're really large scale, sure, but what the idea is here is there a benefit to 2012? Yeah, there's a huge benefit to 2012. Hyper-V 3, if you haven't played with it, there's a huge benefit to it for a few other reasons other than these what seem to be extraordinary numbers. There's a couple of other things that gives them a benefit. In fact, let me clear the screen here again and give you a couple of the other ones. Let's see. So with my nicely cleared screen, besides the old VHD, the .VHD drives that you have, we now have VHDXs, which go up to like 64 terabytes. So they're now VHDXs, 64 terabytes. We have this thing called SMB3, which gives us a lot of capabilities. We've got faster data transfer. We can do VM to VM copies much faster with Hyper-V. Now, a couple of the things that you're going to need with Hyper-V is that you are definitely going to, if you're going to use it, you've got to be on a 64-bit platform. That's probably a no-brainer to you already. And at minimum, your server needs to have, your host would need to have 4 gigs of RAM. Now, this is just the absolute minimum for you to, play with something. If you want to do it on a laptop, something like that. We've got much better direct access to your storage for your IOPS. And much better network adapter performance. But here's one of the cool things, and really this is one of the reasons why Hyper-V works so well for me, is have you played with 2012? And I'm going to write it as GUI. That's the server install. Now, this isn't the default server install for 2012. You actually have to select that you want the graphical desktop. That's fine and dandy, but here's the deal. The best way to run Hyper-V now is on the default install for 2012, which is Core. Now, before you panic and go, now wait a minute. You want me to put my stuff on a Core box? I'm not so sure I'm up to managing a Core box yet. Well, you probably are more than you think you are. You can do it with PowerShell. However, I want to point something out. Managing a Core box, you can do with all of the graphical utilities that you would normally use. You just put them on your client. So your client has, you guys run the RSAT tools? Yeah, the remote server administration tools. And then you can manage everything on your Core. Now, a couple of benefits out of doing this on Core with Hyper-V. First of all, these are benefits to Core overall. It's going to be faster. We don't have all this graphical overhead. We don't have all these additional components that we don't need. That also means less updating and less work for you. I mean, overall, it's less work. To work with it. So for me, using 2012 Core, that's by far the best in managing it. And of course, you still have Exchange running in the VMs. They're still graphical. Everything runs just fine. So if you're the Exchange manager, you would probably never even notice the difference. This is more of something for the virtualization manager. Is if the I'm going to put a dot there. Who's ever managing the virtualization environment, that's the one we really tried to talk them into. Now, that's some basics for Hyper-V, but I want to tie this into, okay, that's Hyper-V, but what about if I'm using other stuff, and what other options do I have for like high availability? So let me clear this screen and let's do kind of a high availability system center other thing. Now, I've cleared the screen again, and I'm still leaving this labeled as Hyper-V because we're actually kind of still talking about Hyper-V, but once again, I also want to add in whatever else it is, whatever else you're using, whatever you have. Sounds good. Because you may be using VMware, and here's a couple of set of notes that'll help you with all of the above, not just Hyper-V. First of all, let's talk a little bit about high availability and the resilient stuff. And if you need to, make sure you check the previous set of videos on high availability and resilience, because we're looking at things like DAGs, the database availability groups, protecting our databases, giving us redundant copies that we can flip to in the event of a problem, and we're also looking at load balancing CAS servers. Well, you have those same features that you can use in virtualization. Couple of things that you want to think about. First of all, here's two hosts. And as I started this out with, what you don't want to do is you don't want to put all of your, I was going to say apples in a basket. Is that? No, I know I shouldn't come up with these phrases. You don't want to put everything. Here's all my my DAGs, my mailbox roles, and here's my load balance CAS servers. I'll put little C's in them there. You don't obviously want to put everything on a single host, because your single point of failure now is that host. So you're going to want to split things up between hosts. You're going to want to make sure that if you're load balancing a CAS, you've got a CAS over here and a CAS on this side. And if you've got DAGs, you want to have your mailbox roles split up across there, so you can have DAGs across there. You just don't want that single point of failure. So you're going to want at least two hosts. Now a friend of mine is in a very small environment and was saying, well, how many mailbox roles am I going to need? I only really need one, and one CAS box to handle my 200 users. Do I really have to set up a whole bunch? Well, no, you can just set up one CAS and one mailbox role here, and then do the load balance and do the DAG across here. And we've talked about that, how many databases you need and how you want to think about it in the previous videos earlier in the course. So you can set this up very simply. It doesn't necessarily require that you have massive amounts of hosting hardware resources to make this go. But here's something that's kind of cool. And I'm throwing this out. This works not just with Hyper-V, but also with other virtualization platforms such as VMware. It used to be that you had to make a choice. A choice? A choice, you say? Yes, you had to make a choice between what we were just talking about now, using the Exchange availability features. So I'm going to put the high availability features. I can't even say the words high availability anymore. Or you could use your virtualization of high availability features. Now, depending on what products you work with, this could be everything from doing things like with Hyper-V, with setting up clustering, and the same thing with VMware, whether you had the hosts clustered and you did rapid live migrations and all that kind of stuff. You had your choice between this one or this one, but not both, because what could happen is that clustering and the virtualization could cause all kinds of problems with the Exchange DAGs. So you had to choose. Well, it just so happens that with Exchange 2013, yes, Exchange 2013, you can combine these two features now. You can have both the high availability features of Exchange, which is always my preference, by the way. Even when we had to make the choice between them, DAGs to me are just blissful and wonderful, and they give me this almost zero backup kind of capabilities. I'm a huge fan of DAGs, and God knows that load balancing a CAS is easy enough. I've always elected for the Exchange high availability features. That's always been my preference. But today, especially when you've got your virtualization experts, they need to make sure that they're covering some things. And Exchange may not be the only VMs running on those hosts. I mean, today a lot of guys got some pretty big hosts out there for virtualization, so they have other VMs, and they're going to want those highly available as well. So they want to have, their host high availability set up. Exchange can tolerate that just fine. What you want to do, especially if you're working with something other than Hyper-V, is like with VMware, there's a white paper that VMware has on how to make sure that you have them both set up correctly and that you've tested it so you don't run into any issues with corrupting a DAG or anything like that. Okay, you won't do that anymore, but you definitely want to check out the documentation if you're going to do both of these at the same time. And today, This is actually becoming pretty common because, like I said, guys that have these bigger hosts for their virtualization platforms are going to have more VMs on them than just the Exchange VMs. And so that'll work out really well. Now, managing this environment. How do I manage all of this stuff? Well, that's, I just don't even want to have to tell you. No, look, you can manage these VMs manually. Again, whether you're using Hyper-V or VMware, whatever your preferred platform is, you can manage all of these guys manually, just like you normally would, like they were on your laptop. However, I want to throw a management concept out to you that I've already mentioned, but is definitely one of my preferences. And that is System Center. And now System Center is like this combination of like 8 different products. And these 8 products, this isn't necessarily everything that you need. You don't necessarily need to have, at least for our conversations, configuration manager and orchestrator and all that kind of stuff. Although you may need those for other reasons in your environment. When it comes to Exchange, what you're really looking at is a couple of things. One, VMM is definitely a way to go because this virtualization machine manager will help you templatize your Exchange server so it's easier to deploy new ones or additional ones to handle future forecasted load. It'll let you manage your environment much easier. It'll also, if you're using System Center, that means you can use Operations Manager. And I got to tell you something. Boy, and I know Greg Shields had mentioned this in the earlier Exchange, I can't write manager. It's either that or I can't talk and write at the same time, which is not a good skill not to have. But SCOM, System Center Operations Manager, and I know that Greg Shields had mentioned, performance monitoring in the earlier Exchange course. And performance monitoring on Exchange, boy, do you want to run performance monitor on every single Exchange server? Do you want to check the event viewer on every single Exchange server and then try to analyze what's going on? I certainly don't because I don't have that much time in my day. So I love Operations Manager because it does that for me. It has the Exchange plugins. It can monitor the performance. It can work with VMM. It can tell me if there's something about to go horribly wrong. Not just the simple things like running out of disk space, but if maybe a CAS server is having an issue and it's recycling its app pools way too many times because something has gone wrong. So to me, the best virtualized environment, well, it's going to be the preferred virtualization platform, which I'm probably going to use Hyper-V unless I'm in a VMware shop. And I'm going to have it on spread across multiple hosts, just like I have here, so that I can have my high availability. And I can have my high availability across multiple hosts. And I'm going to definitely use Exchange's high availability feature. And today I'm okay with having the virtualization high availability feature. And for overall management of this virtualization environment, I'm going to be using System Center. Now, I know to some of you that's like, well, that's a pretty big product to have to deal with. Yeah, well, Exchange is a mission critical application for your network. System Center is going to make your life a lot easier. I'm just saying. And also System Center, it'll let you manage your VMware environment. So you can use it with both. So God knows I've done that plenty of times. So it's worth it. So as we discussed, we talked about the pros and the cons to virtualization. And as I think you will probably agree with me, the cons, well, they're not that bad. I mean, really what it boils down to is a couple of things. Understanding your virtualization environment and what you can and cannot do with your virtualization environment, which means if you're an Exchange person, you probably have to have a virtualization expert for that environment that you're going to run it in, whether it be Hyper-V or if it be VMware, whatever it is that you're going to choose. That means that you probably have 2 teams now that have to have a conversation, especially as we get into all of the high availability options. So, having 2 teams, that means more people, it means a little bit more management, and also your monitoring can be a little bit more complicated because you need to monitor through that virtualization environment. But you know what the pros to this? where, oh wow, we still have all of the great high availability options with Exchange. So you can still use DAGs and you can still do load balancing for your CAS roles. You can also incorporate your own virtualization platform's high availability. So there are benefits to this. And all of the roles in Exchange can get virtualized, and you'll get great performance out of it. Now with Hyper-V, there was a lot of information I gave you about the Hyper-V. You know, we talked about some of the technical aspects of, 2008 R2 versus Server 2012 Hyper-V, how many total VMs you can have. But you know what, at the end of the day, what it comes down to is that what you need to configure and give Hyper-V is the same thing that you would have given your physical hardware to begin with. Something like, if you started out needing to have physical hardware that supported a certain amount of IOPS, input and output per second, to your disks, and your hardware had to have, let's say you had a server that needed to have 8 gigs of RAM. Well, when you go to virtualizing, you still need those same requirements at the end of the day. So virtualization, we still need to keep up with whatever Exchange requires. And we're going to show you throughout this entire course, and even in these 3 videos here, how to start to kind of figure that out. So I hope this video has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.